Muchas gracias a todos los que siguen el segundo foro
Thank you very
internacional de
much
la
to everyone
innovación en
who
la
is following this
justicia
second
en este
International
segundo día
Forum
de
on Justice
actividades.
Innovation
Y
during this
bueno,
second
ahora
day of
continuaremos
activities.
con la mesa
Now we will
Injusticia,
continue
Justicia,
with the
innovaciones que
roundtable.
ponen en pugna tus derechos humanos. Modera Ana Dulce Aguilar García, académica
Injustice
de la Escuela
Justice.
Libre de
We have as
Derecho,
facilitator Ana
y
Dulce Aguilar
participan Jamila
Garcia
Venturini,
from
de Derechos
the School
Digitales,
of Law, and we
Diego
have
García
Jamila
Ricci,
Venturini from
Ibero,
Derechos
Jurídica
Digitales,
Ibero, y Luis
Diego
Fernando
García
García
Ricci from
Muñoz, de
Ibero,
Red.
and Luis Fernando
Muchas
García
gracias.
Muñoz from Red. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this 8th panel in this forum on justice innovation. In this panel, we will talk about innovations that put human rights in conflict. And first of all, I would like to introduce our participants. First of all, we have Diego Garcia Ricci, who is a professor and researcher from Universidad Iberoamericana and director in Jurídica Ibero. He is a specialist in protection of personal data and professor in the School of Law. He also worked in the Judicial Division of different studies, and he has also worked in IFAI, the National Commission of Human Rights. He was consultant and he was a researcher. He is also a lawyer from the School of Law, and he has a master's degree in law and constitutional law in Toronto, Canada. He also has a PhD, and he is author of the book The Right to Privacy, as well as different publications with the right to privacy and the protection of personal data. We also have Jamila Venturini. She is the coordinator of Digital Rights, an NGO in Latin America that defends and promotes human rights. She is also a journalist with different studies from the Latin American University in Argentina, and she is also a member of the Latin American Network of Studies of Surveillance, Technology, and Society. We also have Luis Fernando Garcia Muñoz. He is the director of the Network 3D, which is for the defense of digital rights, and he's also a professor of different universities. He's also a student of the master's degree in human rights, and he has a great experience regarding technology and human rights. With no further comment, thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to ask you a first question to start your interventions. We will start with Diego, then Camila. And I would like to ask you, why should we be concerned about technological advancements? Why is technology a concern for human rights, especially when we're talking about the justice systems? Diego, please go ahead. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this forum. Thank you very much, Ana Dulce, for your introduction. And I would like to greet Luis Fernando and Jamila. I think that it's very important to see the technological developments, because technology is always asking us questions that make us feel sometimes uncomfortable with fears. And there has always been an unavoidable relationship between technology and determinism, that many times we have seen technology as a reality that we cannot stop and as something that we cannot control. We are living a series of events, and the only thing we have left to do is stay put and see where technology is going. And I think that in that regard, we need to be very careful in these technological advancements and see what they are doing when developing these technologies. And this forum makes me think about the decision that Facebook just made a couple of weeks ago of focusing all their approaches in the creation of this metaverse. This metaverse that offers a space of combining the digital reality and virtual reality. And this is everything that we need to know about this metaverse, what type of technology and what type of observations they are going to do about us for it to work. And this goes beyond a mere protection of personal information, because according to what we know so far, most of the success of these metaverse is related to the invasion of our private life, how we react, how we move our eyes, what are our physiological traits. And because we are presenting a certain number of avatars so that we can react before other avatars, and these are going to be related to our behaviors and our decision making. So this is where I think it's very concerning. The things that we are building from the technological standpoint and what Facebook is telling us is that these approaches are going to be focused on augmented reality and virtual reality. And this is what we know, how this industry is being developed. And recently, I had checked a publication by some German researchers that talk about how this visual tracking, or what they call eye tracking, is being analyzed by these companies, because this is the foundation of the success of this AR and VR. What can we see? What are we paying attention to? And what they have discovered is that many of our visual behavior can tell a lot about our private life. And that is going to be the seed for the generation of this new industry, which is what they call this metaverse. So we need to be very careful, because previously we were used to a regulation and a structured governance, mainly based on consent. We consented the use of our personal information for the provision of certain goods or services. And this is going to change a lot of those rules on which this digital world was developed. Why? Because what is happening with this augmented reality and virtual reality is to study the eyes of the people, where we do not have an express consent, and people are not really going to be able to approve their decisions. And what they studied was that people do not control where they are looking. And many of these ideas are going to reveal a lot of aspects from our private life. For instance, they can reveal sexual preference. Obviously, they can reveal certain type of physical preference, or just seeing the way in which a person pays attention to someone else. And I think that's what this is being founded onto. And also, all this development that is being given by these great technology companies is not really transparent. There are not enough publications about it, and we do not know what they are what they are basing on to do this. And I think this is concerning, because part of what we can see in literature is that many of the traditional stereotypes, when a certain type of decisions are based on certain types of decisions, these stereotypes are being replicated when developing these technologies. So I think that we are in a moment, a critical moment, because we are having all this development and we are seeing through this what this is being developed on, and that the economic efforts are focusing on that. But there is not so much transparency. There is not enough access to information, and they are endangering our private life by revealing aspects of our behavior, and even through these eye tracking, our own health conditions. So I think that these innovations are bringing to the table some aspects that need to be concerning, not only in Mexico, but all over the world. And we need to be very aware of this, not only all over the world, but also in Mexico. That would be my first intervention. Thank you very much for the invitation once again. Thank you very much, Diego. And Yamila, I imagine that as a member of the Latin American Network of Surveillance Technology and Society, what Diego is mentioning makes sense for you. So what do you think? Thank you very much, Ana Dulce. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity of sharing with you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to focus a little bit more on how this can affect the justice systems. The first thing that I find important is that digitalization can help the justice systems, for instance, in giving more transparency to judicial processes and internal procedures. I think this is an area in which we still have a lot of challenges in the region. And there are countries in which the requests for accessing information, whether it is for the institutions of justice systems or in general way, are still doing in paper. They demand that people go in person, and that represents for some people an additional obstacle for their exercise of the right to access to information. And even though this is more focused on data privacy, I think it's important to remember that public transparency is fundamental for the protection and the warranty of fundamental rights that include the right to privacy. Our organizations as digital rights, we depend on transparency and access to information, on the implementation of surveillance systems, and the practices of intervention and communications that are implemented by the state in order to analyze and have incidences in our research. But there are also possibilities related to the support to internal procedures of these judicial institutions, maybe promises of artificial intelligence systems that may offer more agility in the decision-making process. I think that there is a larger trend in the region of adopting this type of system. And I think that it is important to understand what their characteristics are, what they are useful for, and what they are not useful for, what they do and what they do not do. And what are the criteria that we need to observe when we consider implementing these type of systems. In digital law, in Derechos Digitales, we did a research in which we analyzed 4 studies on the use of decision-making systems that are automated or semi-automated by the state in the region. And one of the cases that we analyzed is a case of Pretoria, which is a system that is in the implementation stage in the Institutional Court of Colombia, that is trying to facilitate the decision-making process through the presentation of summarized cards and statistical data. This is a system that is not trying to replace human decision-making, but to be an aid in that. So by doing the reflections that we can do in what is the extent in which a person can do, as Diego mentioned a few minutes ago, if they have the capability or the desire to go against a suggestion that a technological system is doing, especially considering the reliability, the neutral standpoint. So it's interesting to think that in this specific case, they are not trying to have a decision made, but they are asking to have additional resources for that, which seems interesting at first. We are analyzing this system, as I mentioned, in the framework of this research. I can share more data about it later, but I think it's important to mention that the use of these type of systems is more complex when it's about making human decisions automated, because it can include a lot of algorithmic biases that can be found in the databases that are being used for its operation. Maybe we can say that a person is subject to the same biases if they are incorporated to a system. It is more difficult to detect and correct them, since they have a series of layers and additional complexities. A series of agents are involved in the preparation and the deployment of this system. And the same happens in the case of decision-making mistakes that can have an impact in the judicial area by violating the basic right of liberty or freedom. And in the case of making wrong decisions by these type of systems, we know that this is not simple. Some organizations in Latin America, such as Red or Derechos Digitales, we have a lot of experience trying to identify the aspects of accountability when it's about systems that were implemented in the private sector, or when it's about the operation of different platforms such as Meta, which Diego mentioned about this download of contents. And this can also have a very large impact when it moves to the public area and the judicial systems area. It is because of those reasons that it's fundamental that the decisions on digitalization process and automation processes as well in judicial institutions are based on different discussions by representatives from the different parts that can be affected by these type of systems, that are also based on regulations that consider the boundaries and the safeguards in the case of abuse, and also justifications that take into account not only the need of using the systems, but also why these systems are the most appropriate in compared to other solutions that may have an impact that may not be so intense in the exercise of fundamental rights. Those procedures and those impact studies must guarantee that digitalization is not leaving behind people who don't have access to internet, that it's not about an additional obstacle to access to justice, as what had happened in other areas, such as giving economic aid to some areas. For instance, during the pandemic in Brazil, there were a lot of difficulties because the system was exclusively digital and a lot of people were not able to access the system to do the request for support and then have access to their most basic resources. And also this type of impact analysis should take into account the security criteria and as well as the privacy and safeguard criteria regarding personal information. And I think I should emphasize that we need to have a data governance framework that balances the internal needs of the public administration in the case of these institutions, the existing obligations, and the best practices in terms of transparency and access to information. But also we need to pay attention to the safety and protection of people and their personal information. And there is a really large amount of topics that we could consider. There are practices of the uses of systems of crime prediction, and what Diego was mentioning earlier about eye tracking and all of these technologies, which are very concerning in terms of how these type of systems can be implemented. There are a lot of things with legal frameworks, but I would like to leave these topics for the other discussion. Thank you very much. Without a question, we will go back to these concerns, but before I would like Luis Fernando to tell us about RED, which is an organization that is very innovative in this regard because of the digital rights that we have in our country and in the world. What is the experience or what are the main concerns regarding human rights? Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a very interesting discussion. From our point of view, we have always said that technology has a very important idea in order to maximize human rights. We cannot deny that. And we also defend the potential that digital technologies have to maximize the exercise of rights such as freedom of speech, access to knowledge, education, etc. However, we are also aware, and we have always spoken about this, that digital technologies also represent new challenges for human rights, and privacy is one of the issues that can be highlighted when we talk about digital technologies. And in our experience, we have also documented how many of these trends that Jamila and Diego mentioned have grown in the use of technology by different security and justice institutions with very significant impact in human rights. And this is not only about saying that technology cannot have an important role in the pursuit of legitimate objectives, such as fighting crime, etc. However, it is very important to know how. I mean, it would be absurd to say that we don't have technology injustice, as well as saying that any technology makes that any system is better, which we believe these both ends are very questionable. And in this regard, we have documented for years the proliferation of the use of different technologies, such as surveillance technologies, that represent a greater risk. And I insist, it's not about saying that security and justice institutions should not have the technological tools to perform their activities, but in the same way that they are regulated to avoid inherent abuse. And it also represents not only surveillance issues, but also other issues, such as the automated decision making machine that is based in algorithm or in machine learning, because of the certain characteristics of this potential of human rights violation that makes it really complex. When we talk about human rights violations, usually the victims of these crimes are aware that they are being a victim, that they are under different types of crimes that are based on these human rights. You know that you are being a victim of this authority action that you consider to be a violation to your human rights, and you can go to these justice institutions to try and change that. But when we talk about surveillance, when we talk about automated decision making based on the exploitation of your personal information, for instance, those types of impacts that are real, usually the victim doesn't know them, and that stops the victim from having access to justice in order to confront this. But in some cases that we have documented on illegal surveillance or the collection of information in an illegal way with very sophisticated technologies, there are a lot of surveillance types. Even when we can document an important amount of abuse of journalists that were intervened illegally in their communications, having access to justice for this is still very complex because there are no democratic control means for the deployment of these type of technologies. Because what we have seen in Mexico is that there are no controls for the acquisition of these type of technologies, which also encourages corruption, direct establishment by shell companies, etc. But there are also no records on who are operating these systems, who are saying that these interventions should be done, and how this is being used. There is no record of anything. There is a lot of secrecy in this national security institution, and it makes it almost impossible for a victim, even if they detect that their rights are being violated, to have access to justice. So I just have 1 minute, and I would like to mention that this is the problem, but there are also solutions. And it's not only about saying, well, we should not have any type of technology. And well, there are technologies that we should say those should not be implemented. For instance, there are several cities in the US, the European Parliament as well has determined to prohibit the implementation, for instance, of the surveillance of public spaces with artificial intelligence by facial recognition. In this regard, they say this technology is very risky and it does not fit in a democratic society. In the case of surveillance and communication technologies, there are recommendations by the UN where they say, while we do not have effective democratic controls to prove how these are going to be used, we need to stop the commerce of these type of technologies for communications. And it's not only about a previous judicial control that in theory exists. It exists in Mexico, but the exception to these new controls are now the rule in some investigation techniques. And besides this judicial control, we need a control of independent surveillance, which exists in other countries. Also, the right to notify the victim so that the people that are intervene legally in their communications, they need to be notified after that, 6 months or 1 year after that, in order to not put at stake this investigation, and they need to have access to the justice system in order to see if this was illegal or legal. Other types of registration measures is the process of decision making and the investigation techniques for communications, etc. So there is a discussion that we may say it's about security or privacy, and maybe we need to renounce our rights in order to determine this. And it's absurd, especially in countries such as Mexico, where there is a frequent and unfortunate relationship between crime and the government. And it is absurd to try to set a discussion in these terms when in a country such as Mexico, privacy is security, because it's really frequent that even the same security forces of the state are involved in crimes. That's why we need to have these robust systems of democratic control. Thank you very much, Luis. I think that since this is Diego's job, I think he will agree with you about these controls. But I would like to go back a little bit to more basic things in this system. And we have a series of resources. For instance, electronic bracelets or these fitness trackers, or also the electronic cameras, and a series of technologies that we have been given as a support. And I would like to ask Diego, regarding privacy, what do we need to take into account in order to introduce this type of technology in the justice system? Thank you, Anna. I think that we always need to be very careful, and we need to pay attention to this technology in the justice systems, because obviously many of these developments are not shared because of several reasons. For intellectual property, sometimes they cannot mention the entrance of these mechanisms, and this is one of the things that artificial intelligence presents. We cannot necessarily mention it previously because it may compromise the intellectual property. And there are some phases of the development of intelligence in which we can do that, and some others in which we cannot, because they can compromise as well intellectual property. So the application of this technology is where we need to pay attention. If it is complying, if it is respecting, if it's not replicating stereotypes. I think that this is what is going to determine if this is a proper technological system or not. I think that it's very important to highlight this, and we need to be very aware of how this technology is being applied, and if it's really complying with what it promised to be at first. And as Luis Fernando was saying, in the case of facial recognition, it's being proved that it fails. Despite being a technology that offered a lot of advantages, if we see the specific applications, the mistakes are more. And right now, they have decided to displace it, or we have seen the displacement of this technology because it's not ready. So I think that in this regard, the follow-up that was done to the implementation of this technology was very good. So that's why in the United States, more and more states are being added to the prohibition of the use of this technology by the law enforcement, because it does not offer safe results. And also something that Camila mentioned that I think is very important is having discussions with all the involved parties who are going to participate in the use of this technology, and also the people that are receiving that technology, and seeing if this is being applied legally. I'm not against technological development, because I think that we can achieve great things, but I think that we need to surveil it, and we need to be very attentive to doing the necessary steps when it's being applied. Thank you, Diego. And Jamila, going back to this topic, and as you mentioned, we need to have criteria, different criteria in order to generate these mechanisms, for instance of artificial intelligence for the decision making. You said that in the US there are being some algorithms to make decisions on precautionary measures, and they have also had different failures due to what you mentioned. From your point of view and your experience, what are the necessary things that we need to consider when we develop this type of systems? I think that something very important to understand is the type of discrimination throughout the implementation of the system. Sometimes we talk about a bias of the system and we forget that also databases and the identification of we are going to implement a certain system can also mean a certain degree of discrimination. The fact that we are using data, I don't know, of people that are in a vulnerable situation in order to predict certain vulnerability conditions, for instance, that is something that is happening in Chile. There is a system that tries to predict dropouts in school, teenage pregnancies. These are people in vulnerability situations, but they use a databases that is compounded by people who are in this vulnerable situation. And this means that the state is going to identify these situations in a population that is already under these conditions of exclusion or vulnerability, as you mentioned. So this is a cycle in which these inequalities are being reinforced. And when we think about these systems of predicting crime behavior, sometimes the same happens, because when we have some cases documented in the US, how these type of systems end up reinforcing exclusions and of historical inequalities, indicating that certain neighborhoods where there are greater situations of crime rates, and also they are reinforcing and facilitating the possibility for the law enforcement to do an intervention there. So I think that in this layer, it's crucial to have a reflection on how this process is being designed in a comprehensive way. The fact of implementing, for example, facial recognition chambers with security objectives in the public transportation means that only the people that are using this public transportation are going to be affected by this type of systems. Another people that do not depend on this transportation are not. And there's also a segregation on the type of rights that different populations will have. So I think this is very important in the Latin American context as a very basic reflection besides what I mentioned initially.
Thank you very much, Jamila. Luis Fernando, you were saying privacy is security, but it seems that we always have the opposite dilemma, that there will always be a tension between security and privacy, and sometimes this cannot be overcome. You know the Mexican context. What are the strengths and weaknesses of our institutions to solve this dilemma? As I was saying before, and if I can present this more broadly, in Mexico, unfortunately, there is a collusion between authorities and crime. This is frequent, going through, newspapers kiosk, and you can see on the first page that we had policemen who were kidnapping soldiers that were involved in extrajudicial proceedings or forced disappearances. So in a country with such institutional weakness, both in terms of its design and norms, it's absurd to tell the society that we must blindly trust authorities that are usually caught committing crimes against the citizens themselves, and even crimes like, cyber crime and digital crimes. For me, it's paradox and how we imagine this stereotype of a person with a black hood, in a black hood, in a black hoodie, in a basement, hacking and stealing money from people. When there is further evidence of cyber crime operating from the institutions, spying people working in the human rights field, so we have to uh, acknowledge this risk, which is not hypothetical in nature, but it has been proved to be frequent. The risk that authorities themselves are the ones committing crimes and abuses against the citizens. And in this sense, it's not about the prosecutor officers do not have the means to justify to intervene communications without justification. But when they're going to be using these technologies, we will have accountability about their wealth. And it's not the case today. And for years, authorities, even locally, have intelligence technologies, and I will say several. We have seen the purchase of false mobile telecommunications, and we have a mass surveillance. It's not just focalized against a specific person. We deploy these false antennas, and we are collecting all of the information that allow to identify all of other people who um, attended a demonstration we're speaking about malware, facial recognition in the public space that is happening already in some places like Coahuila, the Mexican federal city of Coahuila. We can speak about other technologies, geolocalization, mass analysis of databases that allow to get information of geolocalization and internet users identification. And a lot of these technologies have been used and for which we have no specific regulation. These are purchased freely by the authorities. And what's paradoxical here is that with the recent reforms to law, if these technologies materialized, if this is appealed at the Supreme Court, it's going to be more difficult for a common citizen to buy a mobile phone than for an authority, a state authority, to buy a sophisticated surveillance malware system, because now it's going to be requested for people to give our biometric information to buy a tip when the state authorities are not asked for anything. They keep everything in a secret. We have overprices, and the use of these technologies have no records. We have no type of independent surveillance here and supervision. Again, this is not about preventing the use of technologies, but we have to fight against technological solutionism and the speech celebrating the use of technology in justice systems without questioning to the House and the controls that could be in place for this. And this has been mentioned a lot lately, even by being aware of the discrimination risks we could have. We're speaking about a lot of automated systems for crime prediction and sentence definition, like in the United States, facial recognition. All of these technologies have been approved to be biased, racial, gender, that affect specific communities and populations which are already vulnerable, which are affected from the very beginning because of inequality, and it has a differentiated impact on them and prevent them from having access to justice. We have seen cases of facial recognition in which people are detained, as Diego was saying. These are errors, but not equal errors. It's more when we have dark skin or darker skin people, or trans people, women, or people of Afro descendants, and why people are clearly detected by a person from different gender, social, economic, or race conditions are going to be faced. And they say that they are responsible for a crime commission. And here you are there in a pre-trial detention, and this is going to create a very harmful effects, just to mention some. So that's why we're making a call to be responsible, not to be celebrating nor rejecting technology in justice systems a priori, but we have to make decisions about what is valid and what is not, and what is valid. How are you going to have the controls so to maximize the rights and not to reduce them? Thank you very much, Luis. You are speaking about a very difficult issue, and it's the lack of transparency in this type of mechanism, especially in the justice systems, in which we have a lot of solutions that apparently are like, the eighth wonder. And the truth is that we do not have this type of democratic controls that you were mentioning. Now I will move to some questions that we have from the public, and we have a specific one for Jamila. Luis Villarreal is asking whether we have to speak about digitalization or rather about the digital transformation of the justice sector. What do you think about that? We have a lot of digitalization challenges that were not overcome either in the justice system or in a broader sense. That's why, I prefer to speak about digitalization in a more general and broader way. Today, we could be speaking about datafication, so to speak, because many of those systems are based in the collection and processing of countless personal data. And from here, we have a lot of the concerns about which we are discussing at this table. There is a speech about digital transformation, but I think that this speech in itself entails an improvement which is intrinsic to digital transformation. So I think this is not an appropriate term, at least from the perspective we are mentioning here, that concerns the fact that the good or the bad in the use of any technological system is in their conditions and the way in which it's such a use is implemented, a system or a technology that is neutral, or that is intrinsically good or transformative or bad in itself. What we do have is evidence that specific systems entail a series of risks for human rights and therefore should be preceded by many controls or definitely be under some more strict control in its implementation. Luis Fernando was saying, but speaking about the request by EU and experts of a deferral, and because of the absence of democratic controls in several states, because of the systems themselves. And also we have the lack of transparency and opacity by international global companies that develop those schemes. So those are things that we should consider when we think about the use of technologies in the public sector. And we have to be very careful with that. So that's why I prefer to avoid the digital transformation speech that has a rhetoric, that has a series of values, that has comes from some economic groups that try to promote this in the region, when actually we should be thinking about what we need in our context in Latin America, in our countries, for the specific needs that we have, and not just by a speech that a specific way is the best one or the most appropriate one. Thank you very much, Jamila. And in this sense, Diego, would we need a national public policy to move forward in these topics? What do you think about that? Do we need new laws or different public policies? What do you think about that? I think that we have to pay attention to what is being done globally. And I think that this is rather focused on the design of a governance scheme so that allow for the technological development, but not leaving people aside and not preventing them from the opportunity to take part in the design and the application of these technologies. Yes, this is a topic that concerns us all beyond the perspective of the countries of our region, which are countries that we do not have such an important technological development, but that are good consumers of it, and also in terms of the bad application of these technologies. When we speak about a legislation, would be risky because sometimes legislation is not the best way to balance the different conflicting forces. But I would opt for a governance scheme and that are structured based on principles, which is basically how we try to balance these conflicting forces that we see. And for me, it is very serious that at the beginning of this administration, we left that national digital strategy aside that have been built in the country, because evidently this was establishing a way maybe it's less than what exists in other countries, but it opens institutional mechanisms to bring to Mexico those governance schemes that are being brought over or that are being developed in the European Union, out of the OCDE, in different countries on a global fora. So I think that I would bet on a governance scheme that tries to balance the different existing conflicting forces around the use of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality, because these are the principles that will allow us to balance this type of forces. Thank you very much, Diego. Luis Fernando, we have another question from the public by Dulce Rebel, and she's saying that at the UNESCO, the recommendation for the ethics in artificial intelligence has just been approved. How will this impact the Mexican justice system? I think that artificial intelligence and its implementation, especially for decision making that impacts public life, represents a series of important challenges, especially for justice systems. I think that to contextualize the problem, when we introduce an AI system making decisions that can negatively affect people, and they can be for several times, even many that are taking place already without we know and without us being aware of this, and most people being aware of them, that there are systems are making decisions that impact our lives every day. And AI systems are already being used for decision making in terms of who we are going to hire or not. The decision making may be assisted by an AI system in terms of hiring. Or, these are many decisions that have sometimes an AI component. And this can have problems of human rights, discrimination, exclusion, and there are many identification systems allowing or making mistakes that I identify wrong people and prevent their access to services, or which accuse them of the commission of a crime. In this way, there is a questioning whether our judicial system is ready or is trained to exercise a scrutiny over those technologies, and being able to determine and assess whether the implementation of these technologies and the decisions being made based on them are violating rights that the judicial system is responsible for protecting. I think it's an important challenge. I don't like the ethic in ethics. I don't like speaking about ethics in AI, but rather of, it's not a matter of ethics. Ethics sometimes, appeals to the goodwill of people, and I think this is not enough. There must be a respect of human rights beyond the AI implementing agencies bona fide. And we have to question some notions that are very rooted in our system, such as the transparency. What have we got right to know in terms of information? The electoral institution is, from our perspective, in a very responsible way, is fostering the design of an internet voting system. However, audits that are conducted are being reserved because of national security. The national code for processing voting is not public, and it cannot be reviewed by anyone, not even awards systems So systems can be tested in terms of their vulnerabilities. We do not even have this type of system. So how can the citizens be sure that those systems are not altering votes in terms of electoral justice, and how you can have access to justice and say that voting is not complying with the popular will, and I have no way to show this because the victim, no, the victim, neither the victim nor the judiciary have the power to conduct such a scrutiny. That's why we have to focus on this system so we can assess and test and detect the effects of automated decision making based of technology based decision making technologies that we can define as AI. And I think that's an important challenge that goes through regulation, transparency, and judicial operators training. So we can make sure that these systems will maximize the exercise of human rights and will not be tools for the violation thereof and go unpunished, which is difficult to appeal at the court. Thank you very much, Luis. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. This was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to the public for such interesting questions. And well, basically, well, not basically, but mainly, I will keep some important topics here. Transparency. We always need transparency in the use of technologies in the justice system. It's always very important to have broad discussions to implement this type of mechanisms, democratic controls, and of course, as Diego was saying, in a principle-based governance scheme that allows us to guide the use of these technologies in justice. And it's very important to understand what Luis Fernando was saying. We have to be more critical around the idea of a technological solutionism. And from the point of view of Jamila, in terms of algorithms and the use of AI in justice systems, we have to be very critical about that as well. And especially we have to look for further participation from the construction thereof, because this will well, this will be relevant for us because it's going to be strengthening what we already know, especially for criminal processes in which we have a selectivity over some groups and algorithms for governance and society, and algorithms have not helped us in this sense. So thank you very much. And I don't know if you have any conclusions to share. We have some 30 seconds for each one of you. So please just open your microphones and go ahead. Well, if there are no further remarks, thank you very much, Diego, Luis, Jamila, and thank you, Max Weber, and the Friedrich Haumann Foundation for this call to this forum. Thank you, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone.